Welcome to the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, an audio presentation of the Scottish Rite Journal, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. This week's article is The First House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. by Brother Chris Ruley, 32nd degree, and comes from the November-December 2020 issue of the Scottish Rite Journal. For most visiting Masons and their families, the House of the Temple often tops the list for Masonic sightseeing destinations in our nation's capital. The edifice features impressive architecture, a robust library, and rich history. While visitors walk through its stately corridors each year, they may not realize that the Supreme Council's headquarters on 1733 16th Street in Northwest Washington is actually the second House of the Temple. For its first 30 years, the council occupied a modest 4-story dwelling downtown, which was later sold to the Valley of Washington, the District of Columbia's local Scottish Rite bodies. As the Washington Valley commemorates its 150th anniversary this December, we look back at our first House of the Temple and its stewardship under the district's Freemasons. When Grand Commander Albert Pike moved to Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1869, he brought with him the Supreme Council's executive offices. Sovereign Grand Commander Pike first took up residence in neighboring Alexandria, Virginia, and helped reorganize the district's local Scottish Rite presence, which languished during the Civil War years. While Secretary General Albert Mackey accompanied him to D.C., illustrious Pike also tapped several district Masons to help manage the council's affairs. Dr. Mackey died in 1881, and Pike appointed William Morton Ireland, the district's first Grand Cross recipient, as his successor. One of Ireland's main tasks was to oversee the first House of the Temple's construction. On October 18, 1880, the Supreme Council voted to acquire a building to consolidate its executive offices and the Grand Commander's quarters. A committee identified a 4-story house on 218 3rd Street, later rezoned to 433 3rd Street, which it rented for $83.33 per month. The property was purchased completely in March 1881 with $10,000 and on the strength of a $9,000 one-year loan. Pike left Washington the following month to tour the Southern Jurisdiction and raise funds for the remaining debt. Construction delays and Pike's request for a library ballooned the total project to around $25,000. Fortunately, he returned triumphant from the national tour with $15,225 towards the home fund. The council paid off its obligations completely on February 6, 1884, and dedicated the new building on October 22nd. Pike moved in almost immediately and occupied the second-floor quarters until his death in April 1891. As membership grew across the country, the council's executives realized the modest headquarters were unable to serve its needs. It often relied on using the Valley of Washington's own cathedral on 1006 G Street for event overflow, especially during their biennial sessions. On December 9, 1909, Grand Commander Richardson announced his proposal to sell the House of the Temple to the Valley of Washington in exchange for its hall on G Street. Richardson planned to sell the G Street property to finance construction on the second and current House of the Temple on 16th Street. The Supreme Council and District of Columbia Scottish Rite, DCSR, finalized the transaction a month later, and on February 1, 1910, the DCSR moved into the original House of the Temple on 3rd Street. With the first House of the Temple now under local stewardship and flush with cash from the sale with the Supreme Council, the DCSR capitalized on an advantageous situation. The DCSR renovated its new home into a modern fraternal headquarters. Master Masons and their guests entered the first floor to find the General Secretary's office, a large banquet hall, and a preparation room for candidates. The second floor featured a large billiard room, library, and women's reception rooms. Pike's bedroom on the second floor was converted into a memorial museum, while his office remained relatively intact. The Cathedral Hall took up most of the third floor, which included a stage, 400-person seating, large pipe organ, and dressing rooms. The Albert Pike Camp Guard, a predecessor to today's Knights of St. Andrew, occupied its own room. The heads of the 4 Valley bodies, Mithras Lodge of Perfection, Evangelist Chapter Rose Croix, Robert de Bruce Council of Caduche, and Albert Pike Consistory also maintained their own space. While Pike's personal library moved over to 16th Street, the new Memorial Museum included many interesting relics donated by former colleagues. At its height, the renovated library rivaled the House of the Temple and served as an important resource for researchers, candidates, and Masonic students. The building even hosted local civil defense activities during the First World War through the Home Defense League. Semi-annual reunions during the Roaring Twenties often tested the cathedral's maximum occupancy as reunion classes reached over 350 candidates. DCSR trustees considered selling the property to fund a larger temple, but the priority shifted after the stock market crashed in October 1929. Membership numbers picked up in 1935, and the building's trustees were once again confronted with the need for more space. In 1936, DCSR trustees voted to acquire a tract of land 1 mile north of the second house of the temple and approved $500,000 towards construction. Mithras Lodge of Perfection held their final communication in the old building on May 7, 1940, and entered into an agreement in November to rent the property to the United States government. A year later, the United States declared war on the Empire of Japan, which thrust America onto the world stage in the Second World War. In the fall of 1948, the veterans of foreign wars submitted an offer to purchase the former House of the Temple for $70,000. The DCSR deferred the decision to the Supreme Council, as it was generally believed that the building would be reacquired by the Council to develop an Albert Pike Museum. They received a second proposal by the Washington Housing Corporation, WHC, in December 1948 for $75,000, now around $806,000, adjusted for inflation. With no objection by the Supreme Council, the DCSR finalized their sale to the WHC on March 2, 1949. While the craft can no longer claim ownership to this historic edifice, the DCSR commissioned photographers in 1910 to preserve the building's legacy. These special photographs help us better understand the meeting places which our Masonic ancestors once called home. Any accompanying photographs or citations for this article can be found in the corresponding print edition. The Scottish Rite Journal is published by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. Mark Dreisenstock, 32nd degree, KCCH, Managing Editor. I'm your host, Matt Bowers.